Welcome back to the Supercoach Fundamental Series with me, JD. In our first video, we went over the basics of player assessment and how different types of players fit into these categories. If you haven't watched it, I do suggest you start there, but the quick overview is that we look at three main things. How much do they cost? How well do they score? And can they play every game? Written here as price, scoring, and durability. Each of the main types of players, namely rookies, mid-prices, fallen premiums, traps, avoids and hard avoids, as well as our solid picks and locks, are based on these categories. Or fall into these categories, I should say. We can get an edge over the competition by picking or avoiding players based on an evaluation of them, with the goal being to find more players we can lock in. When looking for value, particularly in mid-prices and fallen premiums, these players are cheap because of previous injuries. If we can find the players who are less likely to get re-injured or perform poorly after an injury, and avoid those who are more injury-prone and less likely to return to previous form, we can get a better hit rate when picking these types of players. Now, just quickly, before we get into the next section, I just want to say that the way we assess injuries and players and the effects of them can come across as callous and cold. While we look at the impact from a place of logic, almost like Spock, I guess, to make strategic moves in a game, we shouldn't forget that these injuries have a real impact on these players, their lives, and their families. Increasingly, we see players get abused for not performing in fantasy sports, and that simply isn't on. So please keep that in mind as we go through kind of this conversation. So, why is it important? A season-ending injury is very costly. Namely, you lose a trade correcting the pick, which we value roughly at 150k, and if that occurs during the upgrade season, so roughly from round 6 onwards when you're upgrading your rookies to premiums, you can also get delayed a week in upgrading a player, which will cost you hundreds of points over the course of the season. And then secondly, even if an injury isn't season ending, each week a player misses costs you on average 55 points. So this is the difference between what your premium would have scored on average and the rookie you field to replace them. This of course could be more or less depending on your luck. And this effect can be even worse during buys where you don't have a replacement whatsoever. This equation does change during the season, which should just keep this in mind. So as the season progresses, the injury risk of a playing footballer does decrease as they are further removed from last year's injury, and there are simply less games for them to get injured in. Secondly, while this risk of injury does decrease as the year goes on, any injury that you end up getting has a much larger impact on your side, as you're now effectively dividing that 55-point game over fewer games. So in the examples here, if you lose 55 points over the course of the season, it's roughly 2.5 points to your player's average. But if you only had, say, 5 games as one of your last upgrades and you lose them for a match, it's effectively like picking a player that had a 11 point per game lower average over that 5-game period. So it does have a larger impact. So these things are kind of offsetting. All right, so we've kind of gone over the nuts and bolts. How do I assess durability? Well, I've got a few things here that we consider, and I think this covers most of the stuff that you should be running through. So what was the type of injury? How many injuries have they had? How long since they've had that last injury? Do people that suffer that injury typically return to pre-injury form? Have they had a full preseason? How old are they, and have they changed position? To help you with assessing injuries, I've done a bit of legwork on researching the most common injuries and the impact on AFL players. Let's start by looking at the most common injuries from, I think this is a 2018 report we've got here. And I guess 2018 is representative. This stuff largely is consistent year to year, despite there being some changes. How we read this table is as follows. So the incidence is how frequently do these types of injuries happen per year per club. So there was an average of 7.3 hamstring injuries per club during this course this year. The games missed is when a player suffers this type of injury, how many games did they miss on average? So for a hamstring, on average, they miss 3 weeks. And then finally, prevalence. or effectively like total impact to a club, I guess is another way of looking at it. So this is incidents times by games missed, which equals the average number of games missed per club per season for each type of injury. So for example, for hamstrings, 7.3 of these per year times by 3 weeks per injury equals roughly 22 games missed for the year per club, with rounding in that number. All right, so I guess like just a couple of observations here. When looking at prevalence and total games missed per year, hamstrings and ACLs are still the most common single injury type, which kind of runs true with the logic of what you'd expect, if you've been watching footy for a while. These are kind of pipped by two groups of amalgamated injuries. So other leg and foot injuries include things like fractures, Liz Frank, plantar fascia, turf toe, and a bunch of others. And similarly, like ankle is a group of injuries, but the one that has become very like in vogue or flavor of the week in the AFL circles is syndesmosis. So next, I've collected some notes from various medical journals and studies on the effects of these injuries on elite athletes. I'll preface this with two things. Firstly, I'm not a doctor or in the field of medicine. Take my research with a grain of salt. Secondly, the studies represent the average effect in a certain context, but we assess individuals, not averages. This information gives us a clue about how to assess, but won't always be perfectly accurate or representative. So I'm not going to go through this in a ton of detail, but I did want to give you some quick takeouts. I mean, this is like a kind of cheat sheet that you can refer to it later. Firstly, like ACLs and hamstrings are the two areas with the most research on it by far. For hamstrings, I guess like the highlights are older players are more susceptible to hamstrings, and we saw that on the first page with those that are 28, 29, 30 being the most common group. It does drop after that, but that's simply because there are less players in the AFL that are 31 plus. If you've had hamstrings in the past, you're much more likely to have them in the future. This is true for a lot of injuries, but you'll hear it specifically repeated a lot when it comes to soft tissue. Also, players who get rushed back are more likely to re-injure, which I think is somewhat self-obvious. It's also really hard for us to judge as a spectator whether or not this has happened with a certain player, but maybe there are some clubs that are more or less known for being conservative or aggressive with their rehab schedules, and we can consider that. For ACLs, players can return to their peak, but this seems to happen during or after the second year of that injury. So when returning from ACL, they are both more likely to have another injury or miss games. And we've seen that with players like Sam Doherty recently, but also some of the really sad cases like Menzel and Alec Johnson, who had 4 and 7 ACLs respectively. So this could affect how you think about someone like James Sicily in 2022. A variety of leg and foot injuries make them hard to assess because I didn't go through medical journals on all of these different types of injuries. If a player does go down with one of them, it's best just to deep dive then on that injury. So I did that with Marshall last year, for example, on, I think he had plantar fascia, right? Yeah, because it was like torn and then niggling issues and whatnot. But I guess like the upshot is many of the bad foot injuries can be career ending or seriously derail them. There's lots of examples, such as Dane Swan's a really good one, took years off. James Hird, another good example. But these tend to be really hard to get over at AFL level, probably just because of the volume of running and the type of injuries they are. And this seems to be especially true for bigger players like rucks. I'll touch on syndesmosis briefly. I couldn't find a lot of literature, especially as it relates to AFL, but the limited amount I did find suggested that if you repair and rehab them well, you can not only get back to the top level, but you also don't seem to have a greater chance of re-injury. So this could bode well for someone like Butters, who did have, I guess, a more serious syndesmosis last year. Shoulder injuries are more likely to happen while tackling. Roughly 40% happen that way. The long-term outlook on these seems to be better than most other injuries though, which is good, so there is still hope for someone like Josh Dunkley. Calves really are an old player injury. If you see an older player with a history of calf problems, it's best to avoid. Shannon Hearn is a good example of this. PCLs, so while less severe than ACLs, they do have a much higher reoccurrence rate. As a fun fact, these are commonly known as ruckman injuries. These are more likely to occur due to impact, and so for rucks, this was with them running at each other at starting bounces. The rules were actually changed in the early 2000s by bringing in the 10-meter arc for the rucks to start their run-up within, and that successfully actually reduced the amount of PCLs, which is, I think, pretty interesting. Duncan, Rao, McGrath, CJ, and Impey were all examples who went down in the last year with this type of injury. Concussions, which is obviously top of mind when it comes to injuries at the moment, and from the research I have been able to find, it does appear that each previous concussion increases the likelihood of a future one, which could play with someone like McCartan we saw. But in the studies, it doesn't seem to reflect that there's an impact on player performance. So I guess as players get these throughout the years, just keep in mind that the likelihood that they get another one does increase, but it shouldn't impact performance. And then I guess the last thing I call out is Achilles. So this one was quite interesting. I found an NFL study, or a study that looked at NFL players who had ruptured their Achilles, and almost none of them returned to their best. So they referred to it as a career-altering injury, with performance significantly reducing in the years after. So I think that's not to scare you off all Achilles injuries, but if you do see someone that's ruptured an Achilles, that's a steer clear sign. So when looking at a particular player, understanding the different type of injuries, how severe that injury type was, and what the literature says about it can go a long way to answering questions such as the likelihood of reoccurring, how likely they are to get back to pre-injury form, and what risk factors you need to consider moving forward. But the main takeouts we've got here, which is in general, prior injury increases the future risk of that same injury, which is, I think, common sense. Next, the older players get, the more likely you are to get an injury, which is why you'll hear many people say they try to avoid starting players over the age of 30. Returning players are most likely to re-injure within the first year, and that's especially true for injuries like ACLs and shoulder reconstructions. Lastly, it's common for players to struggle to return to their previous best after major injuries, especially in the short term. So for someone coming off an ACL, it does seem to take 12 to 18 months for them to start to get back to their best. Finally, let's put this all together and apply it to one of our use cases, an injury-prone mid-pricer. So, does Charlie Curnow become more or less interesting as we assess his durability? Let's find out, because we want to move him closer to a lock or further away and strike him from our list. All right, so on the top part here, I've got the 7 things that I'd listed out on the first page that we can kind of go through, and we're going to mark Charlie on each of those. So what was the type of injury? Charlie has really had a injury-riddled career, especially in the last couple of years. So he's had multiple serious knee injuries as well as MCL problems. I've got the full 7 listed there, but from what I've seen in the literature on a bunch of these, they're actually quite hard to return to, so the fact that he stacked up 7 is alarming. How long since he'd last had an injury? So assuming he makes it to round 1, it will be 16 months from November 20. Do people who suffer that injury return to their pre-injury form? So I saw a interview with Adam Cooney, who also had a cracked patella. It sounds like he might have been more serious than Charlie Curnow, so worthwhile to keep in mind. But he cracked at the end of his Brownlow year, was never the same, and he seriously doubts that Charlie can actually get back to his best. And you got to remember, before his injuries, Charlie was talked up to being the next Koutafidis. In fact, maybe even better. I think his last game before his first injury was something like a 7-goal effort, 150 Supercoach points. So he did have a really high ceiling, but I guess Cooney's saying there's a small chance he gets back to that top potential. And then Nick Newman, I thought was interesting. He's also having patella problems at the moment and hasn't returned to his best, and he's had re-injury. And I think that's quite interesting because he's at the same club as Charlie. And you would, this makes me a little bit more nervous just because they haven't demonstrated that Carlton can actually manage that injury properly, or that type of knee injury properly. So that makes me a little bit nervous. Did they have a full preseason? So One of the things that I really like about Charlie is he did finish out the end of 2021, and he appears to have completed all of the preseason so far. But we want to make sure he completes all of that all the way through to the start of 2022. How old are they? So good age, he's definitely not up there. He's not in the old age, 25 in the 2022 season. That's great. And then lastly, have they changed position? This one may sound weird, and it's more of an observational one of mine, but you do see, well, not necessarily just observational. So as we kind of mentioned, there are some injuries that are more likely to happen playing certain positions. So you're more likely to do a shoulder tackling, which, goes to certain roles. You're also more likely to do hamstrings or quads or certain types of soft tissue injuries based on position as well. Like if you're bending over a lot in the midfield and tackling, you are more prone to these types of injuries. So what you can see in particularly forwards and midfielders, I've seen if they are swapped to different positions where they are less likely to get injured, this is a good thing. So for example, they might be playing loose behind the ball. There's like a really good example where we've seen players like Hall and Zeeble in the last year kind of reinvigorate and reinvent themselves and kind of getting away from their injury prone status. But yes, he doesn't mark particularly well on that. I think it's safe to say that even if Charlie Curnow returns successfully this year, the likelihood that he can reach his full potential is very low. Overall, I was surprised by the sheer number of injuries that he's already had. There is a high likelihood he has another issue in the future. And as I mentioned, the chance he reaches his full potential is low. On the plus side, there are some things that I really like to see. He's still young. He finished the last 4 games of last year without setback, and he's on track to complete a full preseason. This leads me to believe that if he makes it through the preseason fine, he is someone we can consider. But the slightest hint of a setback and he becomes someone you are likely to avoid. If you needed Curnow to be a keeper, so for example, imagine he was a fallen premium rather than a cash generator or a stepping stone, he would just be a straight out avoid. While I'm hoping I'm wrong and he is fit and firing all year, I would say there is a very low chance he plays 22 this year. And even if he does, I think he will be heavily managed throughout that. And really, that's it. In this video, we've gone over the basics of why durability is important, how to assess the durability of a player, the common injuries, their risk factors, and how they impact players. And we've applied these concepts to assess a player. In the next video, we'll go into more detail on how to assess their scoring. If you are enjoying this series, please let me know below. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next one.